Welcome to the opening event of the 2021 Save Venice Boston Lecture Series. I am Jim Johnson. I am the co-organizer of the lecture series along with Chris Carl Smith. I'm happy to be with you today for a live presentation from Italy on Torcello and the origins of Venice. Now, before we hear from our speakers today from Italy, I want to say a word about our other two events in the lecture series this spring. Let me take a moment and share my screen with you. Our second lecture in this series features two contemporary artists, each with a special connection to Venice. This is Venice through the eyes of painters. And our guests include Jorge Pombo. Jorge Pombo, who is with us today, is a young Spanish painter born in Barcelona. He has had solo exhibits in Switzerland, New York City, Monaco, Cologne, Verona, and Venice. And his work in recent years has been in dialogue with Tintoretto. And what we see here, Jorge Pombo's variation on a Massacre of the Innocents. This appeared in a special exhibition in the Scuola Grande di San Rocco these past months, that is the last year, as part of the Tintoretto 500 events throughout the city. And we see here Tintoretto's original Massacre of the Innocents, and we see what Jorge Pombo has done in this variation on the Massacre of the Innocents. Joining Jorge Pombo will be Robert Kushner. Robert Kushner has done pioneering work in figurative and decorative art, in painting, woodblock prints, and collage. He has been influential from the 1970s to the present. His career includes single artist exhibitions at the Whitman Museum, Brooklyn Museum, and the Philadelphia Museum of Contemporary Art. His work has appeared twice in the Venice Biennale, and their discussion will be moderated by Lee Essex Doyle. That is Tuesday, March 30th, 6 p.m., Venice Through the Eyes of Painters. We are happy that both Jorge Pombo and Robert Kushner are with us today for today's presentation. Our third lecture is by the renowned art historian Patricia Fortini Brown, figure familiar to all of us whose works have been absolutely influential and epoch-making in the history of Renaissance art, Professor Emerita, Princeton University. She will be speaking about her current book about the public image and lived reality of exceptional women in Renaissance Venice. She will focus on one extraordinary marriage that set off deep personal and political conflicts in the city. And of course, it will be illustrated with sumptuous paintings that she is so familiar with. April 27th, 6 p.m. If you have not yet reserved places for these two lectures, please do so by contacting Susan Angelostro. Finally, I want to say a word about the most recent Save Venice Boston restoration commitment. This is a commitment for the restoration and the preservation of 24 drawings by Pietro Longhi, and you will perhaps recognize these drawings, really a chronicler of everyday life in 18th century Venice. This is the subject of our current annual appeal, and you see these beautiful images, the mandolin player, vintners, common people. You see the gentleman there, his hat, taking a kind of relaxing sit, and this beautiful lady at the spinning wheel, which Frederick wrote so eloquently about in the recent newsletter. This set of restoration is done to honor the work that our friend and colleague Peter Ferguson has devoted to Save Venice over a period of decades. This exceptional work, Peter Ferguson, a scholar, an author, an influential teacher to his students, two-term chair of Save Venice Boston, and a member of the executive committee for more than 40 years. As I say, this is the commitment of the organization, and it is the subject of the annual appeal. And if you've not yet had a chance to contribute to the annual appeal, you can do so at the link which will appear in the chat box. This is the Save Venice Boston site, and you will find at the bottom of this link a button that says Make Donation. And we urge you, if you've not yet had a chance to do that, that you will make a contribution. Let's turn now to our subject of today's lecture, that is Torcello and the Origins of Venice. We have with us two guests to talk about Torcello and the origins of Venice. We are here today to learn about the history of the island of Torcello, the restorations that are underway at the Church of Santa Maria Assunta, and other current projects of Save Venice Boston. Our first guest, our first speaker, is the archaeologist Diego Calaison. Dr. Calaison has devoted his research to understanding the physical origins of Venice from the very beginnings. His work includes assessments of the historical impact of ecological change on the landscape and on the area. He has served as site director on several archaeological projects in the Venetian lagoon, including Torcello. He has also worked in Syria and along the Dalmatian coast as an archaeologist. He's an author of over 100 scholarly contributions. He's worked collaboratively with Stanford University. He is currently the research archaeologist of ancient topography at the Ca' Foscari University in Venice. We welcome Dr. Diego Calaison.
Thank you very much for having me, and good morning to everyone. I'll start right away on sharing my screen so we can start speaking about this very topic, the origin of Venice. And I will do that through the lens of archaeology and through the lens of a specific and special site that is Torcello. Try to narrate to you a different story, an alternative story from the main one that we all know. I will use archaeological record, and also I will try to guide you through a complex narrative that starts with the Roman age and ends with the birth of Venice. That is not the 421 as we celebrate normally the birth of Venice, but is something that have to be checked in the 9th century. But I will tell you in detail in few seconds. So, how did Venice came into the world, and how looked like the landscape around Venice at that time? If we have to choose an actual landscape to compare it, I think we can use Lio Piccolo area in the northern part of the lagoon. That it seems that look like really how the Venetian lagoon was before Venice. A very handmade land and water area where there were few people living in and a lot of water for production, used for production, so salt and fish. This is a map of the places that I will speak a little bit today. We will start with Altino, the Roman city in the area, and also we will go on Torcello, Lio Piccolo, San Francesco, and asking how Rialto, so the city center of Venice, is positioned in this narrative. As I told you, my special viewpoint is taken from this very excavation that started in 2013 at Ca' Foscari University that I'm directing, and it is still going on, and is a quite big excavation that we are doing around the Santa Maria Assunta church, and the aim of this excavation is to understand the infrastructures, the houses, how Venetians, the early Venetians or the early inhabitants in Torcello lived in such an environment. We are not the first excavating Torcello, and you know how the island, the Torcello Island, is a sort of an archaeological icon. We can say that the very first scientific archaeological excavation in Italy has been done exactly here in front of Torcello Basilica by the Polish Academy in the 60s of the last century. So our work is also collect all these data that are coming from published work, but also legacy data and re-literature data to try to understand how the site worked in the past. I want to start with this. So how look like a house of a Venetian, an early Venetian in the early medieval time? Like that, or at least is the way that we see, we study the Venetian, the first Venetian house. The first element that we can notice is that everything was wooden, timber. In fact, when we excavate the settled area, we found all the cuts, all the negative features that are related with timber construction. This is the main floor of a quite big house with huge big poles at the corner. It was a two-story house. You can see here the basement of the wooden staircase that led to reach the second floor. There was a fireplace on the ground floor, and the house was directly facing the channel, like the today palaces. It seems that this house is a poor house, a poor construction. In fact, the archaeologists that did the same work that I'm doing now in other part of Torcello or even in Venice, they call this construction in the archaeological narratives huts, wooden huts. And it is quite important to define how we call this structure. Are they huts or are they houses? Because if we call them huts, we think that these were not very strong buildings, and we are not speaking about a dense city. We are not speaking about a very structured settlement, but we are speaking about an ephemeral site. What we are learning that these structures are at the contrary, very designed, long-lasting, and the fact that they are built in wood and timber, it is a choice given by the environment. In fact, also the that we find during the excavation is absolutely stunning. We have more and better quality material than in another contemporary site, for example, from Rome or from Verona, a nearby big ex-Roman city. These houses in Torcello were organized in a very design area around a water cistern. All the houses had an equal floor plan with two room at the ground floor and two room at the first floor. Uh, all houses, as I said, they were facing a channel and they were very structured. We can say that these are not houses of people that were escaping the Huns, the barbarian, and they were looking for a temporary refuge, and they choose the Torcello lagoon or the Torcello island for a temporary place to stay, and then they decide to stay. This is absolutely like something very organized, very well designed from a central power that I'm telling you from this very moment, it is the bishop that is organizing the settlement. And we are facing a worker neighborhood, a worker settlement uh, with some peculiarities that I will try to explain in a very detail in a few minutes. So if we have to imagine using a pictorial view how Venice looked like in the early phases, we can use this very famous, very well-known drawing that is a medieval drawing copied in 16th century from the National Library in Venice. Everything was wooden, timber made. The roof were timber made. Even the church or some of the church were timber. So when we are imagining how Venice looked like in the past, we have to get off of the image that we have of the Venice today, and we have to think about a very different settlement that somehow it is difficult to define. Was it a city from the very beginning? What is a village? What is something in between? So probably our the basis that we have about medieval history, early medieval history, made the archaeologists give the archaeologists some troubles in define what the first Venice was. We have a problem with the Venice origins narratives. We have a big myth about how Venice started. We know that according to tradition, there were a group of Roman citizens that they left their original place, for example, Altino, the Roman city nearby Venice, during the early medieval ages, because there were invasions, there were wars, and they moved to Lagoon Island looking for a shelter. And this happened, according to the tradition, under the ages of Byzantium, that gave to these people the opportunity to remain independent, to remain free, to remain linked with the Roman law tradition, with the Roman culture. This myth, this tradition is, we can say now quite openly, it is a completely made up narrative started in the 11th century in very Venice, and started in the Duke Palace, try to find out a nice way to describe the origin of a city that at that time, 11th, 12th century, was growing up, and confronting with other cities around in the Veneto area or in Italy, had the problem, was a new city. All the other settlement, all the other cities, the nearby Padua, the nearby Treviso, the nearby Verona, had a long history, at least Roman or pre-Roman. Venice was new. So there was there was a need to rebuild a nice origin and rebuild a myth, a narrative that could explain how Venice could rule the world, or the Adriatic world. So the traditional narrative describes something like that. We have some places named in the chronicle, in this medieval chronicle, the Origo Civitate Venetiae, or the Chronicum Altinate. There are these places like Cittanova, Eraclea, or Altino, or Patavium, places, Roman places, or new early medieval places where we can trace this transfer, this translation from a Roman place to a new place. This narrative is so strong and became a sort an ontology of Venice itself, then even the archaeologists had some problem during their interpretation of the archaeological record that they were excavating. So, for example, when up to few years ago, we were finding a burnt level in one of these cities, Patavium, Altinum, or Pitergium, we were saying, these are the results of the barbarian invasion. These are the results of the Huns destruction. And at the same time, when we were excavating wooden structure and timber structure, like the ones that I show you before, we were interpreting them as a temporary shelter, as something that need a certain amount of time to be structured and to become the Venice that we know. There is a huge risk on connecting the idea of the lagoon landscape as a forced shelter, as a place where the ancient Roman chosen for be safe and escape the barbarian. The idea that the ancient Roman left Altino and chose Torcello to be safe among the water means, in topographical terms, in environmental terms, that the water at the time was felt like a, a place that was completely detached from the Roman landscape, a place where no one would have been able to reach these fugitives, a place unpleasant, a place with marshes, salt marshes, mosquitoes maybe, a place where only the brave Roman were able to fight and sustain themselves, making Venice. The risk is connected with the role of this water, the role of this small island had in the Roman past and the medieval past. A new archaeological narrative can teach us that this idea of water like a defense, a water like a place that was completely detached from the Mediterranean and the Adriatic world was absolutely a narrative topics made up by the medieval Venice, but in practical terms, in material terms, from what we see from the archaeological, there is another story to be told. We can use an environmental and economic perspective, and we can also use the geographic constraint of the lagoon landscape to tell something different about the origin of Venice. Let's start a little bit with the lagoon area in the Roman age, so really before Venice. You know that nearby Venice, it is not far from the Marco Polo airport, we have this huge sign that is a Roman city, Altino, and you see here the images, the reconstruct images of the city center of the Roman Altino, rebuilt after these fantastic infrared satellite images that help us to understand how the city worked during Imperial Age, so 1st century BC, 1st century AD. Altino was a huge city. For giving you an idea, was the 3rd city of northern Italy during imperial time, Roman imperial time. After Milan and Padua was the biggest one. It had a theater, an amphitheater. Also, it had the 2 theater, a quite big forum, a huge settled area, a channel system that was surrounding the cities, a huge harbor. So it was a quite big element in the Roman landscape. Of course, this city was using its coastline, was using the space that we have from the place, the topographic location of the city itself, and the coastline. Here, these red lines in these lines is the placement of the 1st century AD coast shore that we had in the Venetian area. The red point are all the Roman sites or Roman finds that have been noticed and mapped so far. On the right, you have a little bit more detailed image of these, and you can see that if we study these finds in a critical way, and we try to define which are really infrastructure with Roman stratigraphy connected to them, and we can prove also the chronology with C14 datation and have a certain number of artifacts to understand what these sites are, the main sites are all related to the ancient estuary of the small rivers or channel, lagoon channel that were connecting the coastline with the city of Altino. In this new slide, you have also this blue square that are referring to a very specific finds that we have in the Roman lagoon. These are called argini strada in Italiano, or at least were called argini strada, because I really try to change this definition. Argini strada means road embankments. So we told that these wooden structures filled with amphoras and soil were roads to connect Altino with the sea, or Altino with the other sites in the north part and in the south part of the Veneto region. But looking there more carefully, we understood that the material that they had inside are not first use material, they are reused amphora. So amphora that were used in the main city. We are speaking about hundreds of thousands of finds like that. They were reused as a construction material to refilling structure like in this reconstruction that we made. Structure that were aimed to divide water from water. Why? Fish structure, salt pens, fish, so fishing activities and production of salt. This gives us an idea that this area was at all empty before Venice. And studying the amphoras that they use, we can quite easily understand that this structure mainly they start in the 1st century AD, and they were refurbished and restored at least up to the 5th, 6th century AD. One of these sites that I showed you before have not only one, we have 3 or 4, but I'm presenting you the main one, Leo Piccolo. Leo Piccolo does not have only infrastructures element, but also decorative elements. These are pieces of fresco of a quite huge villa, Roman villa, that can be quite well reconstructed in its presence, in its topographic space. Villas like the Leo Piccolo one were facing the water channels that were connecting the Roman cities in the back with the sea, and they were the control point, the center by which some imperial delegates were controlling slave and labor force on salt production and fishing activities. So the coast area of Altino was not an empty one. And so there was no this idea of escaping in the lagoon for refuge, looking for a refuge during the Roman invasion is not, of course, any more plausible. How is the economic landscape around Venice when Torcello settlement and Venice settlement started? We have to say that the same characteristics that we are analyzing in Rialto and Torcello can be shared with many, many other coastal sites in between the 6th and the 9th and 10th century AD. So we have a series of new settlement, villages, city-like, it is hard to define them, all coastal, all quite new, and all characterized by the fact that they are all timber, wooden built, they have a quite big harbor infrastructure, and there is a certain activity on artisanal production in this very site. If we zoom on the Venice area, on the northern lagoon, we can see that these sites are quite a lot, and all of them, they are placed in this systemic location where rivers and deltas meet the sea. What happened? At the end of the Roman time, starting from the 3rd and the 4th century, the road system on the mainland is completely collapsed and not anymore sustained. So everything that have to move, people, goods, but also ideas, have to move by water. Water of the Adriatic Sea routes, but also the water of the river and the inner channel routes. So these places are in a connection point, are in place where sea routes meet river routes. So places like Torcello, Rivo Alto, or Murano are absolutely well placed to be uh, emporic place, to be trade point in this new way of using the landscape of the Po Plan in the late antiquity and early Middle Ages. So all these sites can be described in somehow using archaeological record with these characteristics. So they are not anymore so rural as they were the Roman one few centuries before. And we see this gradual transfer towards the coastline of ports, markets, and hub system. These sites were open, so there was no any traces, archaeologically speaking, of defenses, walls, castles, if we want to call like that. They are bigger than villages, not yet towns. They are polyfocal settlements with many places with different structure also in large areas making the same site. They were quite rich in natural resources, wood, fish, and salt. This is the first warehouse that we were able to find out in Torcello. It is dated to the 7th century and is a structure that is made in its foundation with reused Roman bricks, all of course coming from the reused structure of Altino. And if you want to know how it worked or how we excavated, I tell you that all the structures are above 2 meters, 2.5 meters under the walking level that you have around the Torcello church. So the first thing in this quite complex stratigraphic sequence that we found was the structure related to these warehouses. Of course, here you see excavating in very small areas, but if we want to imagine how they work, we can use this kind of reconstruction. So they were warehouses with a porch, a front porch facing the channel. We have the same solution adopted in the Ravenna early medieval harbors. Why we know that these places were warehouses and not houses? Mainly for the quality of the artifacts that we found them. 99.5% of the ceramics that we found inside and nearby were amphoras and containers. There is no traces of human food consumption or other elements that speaks about daily life around. Also, there was another element that was quite evident, that this clay here is a huge level of reclaimed and refilled clay that we studied with our geomorphologists, and we understood that this clay was imported from the mainland. For building this harbor area here in Torcello, they move a huge quantity of soil. So even if this structure they seems poor and fragile, at the end, we understood that for making this harbor, there was a huge investment on workforce, uh, for moving harbor structure from where? From Altino to here. Why? Not for the barbarians, but because the Altino area, the inner part of the lagoon, were experiencing a problem with the depth of the channel. So the rivers were um, changing the way that water was moving on the lagoon, on the delta area, and people were looking for new places where the harbor infrastructure could really work and could really host quite big vessel coming from the Mediterranean. As I said, everything is whatever material we have is reused from Altino. So the displacement happened, but happened in long years, in long run. And what was displaced were material elements from the main cities, and with them also the workers that were making this warehouse, were maintaining this warehouse. We can use a different approach using wood, water, and labor as proxy to understand the early Venetian society. Not only Torcello, but also, for example, looking for a very specific site that is Metamauco. Metamauco, according to the written sources, is the first place nearby Venice. It is not the Malamocco. Metamauco is the Latin version of Malamocco. It's not the Malamocco that is in the Lido Island that probably many of you knows. We know that because we excavated Malamocco, New Malamocco, and archaeological finds stop at early 13th century. We know from the written sources that the first Duke of Venice, at least the first one that is very well known in terms of our historical sources, the one that who built the first St. Mark Church, the first Duke place, Duke Palace, Partecipazio, had his property and family properties in Metamauco. What we found in this area, for example, it is nearby Fusina, nearby the industrial area, we find underwater structure like that, wooden structure, houses, warehouses, and it's possible to date with C14 or the poles and the wooden elements, and everything is related in between 8th and 9th century. We have also this kind of finds, so decorated wooden planks with typical Carolingian decoration that probably were related to public buildings or even churches. All this part now is or under the industrial area in Marghera or underwater nearby the Canale dei Petroli, so the channel that the big oil ships are traveling to reach the industrial area. So, as I told you, we have to use wood as an element to define this site. This is a picture that are coming from a nearby harbor, the harbor of Comacchio that I did excavate 10 years ago. And this is a very small square area, square trench. But we can try to estimate how big was the impact of these new harbors. And for Comacchio, for example, but similar calculation can be made for Torcello, we calculated that for making the harbor, people, so bishops, needed between 300, 350 trees cut down and sawed every day for making the harbor, assuming that it was made in around 1 year, or the half it was made in 2 years. It is a huge number. So we have really to change our perspective and thinking wood as something that needed a huge workforce to be implemented. Wood and water, but not only the water as connection, as we said before, but also water for drinking. these settlements are very rich, we said, in fish, in salt, in wood resources, but they are extremely poor in fresh water. And in fact, in all these sites, we find structure like this one, that they are water cistern for collecting water from the rain. Rain that is collected by the roof of these wooden houses, and it is stored in this collective water cistern. So living at the edge, living in the salty, marshy lagoonscape of the early medieval time needs to have a very design and center rule approach, need to be sure that pivotal element like fresh water was provided to the whole population. The whole population that was made by who? Who were the first Venetian? The first Venetian, in large part, were coerced worked. We know that Venice, in somehow, it has been the place where a lot of slaves were funneled to Venice in the 9th century to be traded in the North Africa, in the Arab countries. But what about the people who lived in Venice? For making all these infrastructure, channels, harbors, wooden structure, we needed, or rulers in the past needed, a lot of workforce. Here a calculation for making the Canale della Girata nearby Comacchio. A lot of workers to be employed in reshaping the lagoon, in making functioning this very delicate ecosystem. We can also argue how many Venetians were inhabiting, for example, Torcello. And the number, of course, they are not the 13,000, 14,000 that some narratives in the past gave to us, but the number, it is quite big. It is in between 1,500 and 2,500. So it's a massive number for early medieval Europe. And these were almost all workers, slaves, semi-slaves. This is a big question. For sure, they were not allowed to change their working condition, and they were very connected with the power with the system of power of the island, at least for having their water or for having very specific food supply like meat or animal food. So we can say that if we want to see how Venice landscape changed from Roman period, where we had many slaves working in this fishing and salt pen infrastructure, during the early medieval time, we changed to a different kind of science, where we had manager and knower and owners, mostly bishops or bishops' families or ex-military lieutenants, that they were able to control a quite big number of workers. This change again in between the 9th and the 11th century with the transformation of a new class of free workers that were still controlled by new elites, mostly now related to the clergy and bishops. At the end of this process, we have the transformation of a working class in a very specialized working class, a working class that can provide shipping service. Why? Because everyone there knows how to build the ships. Everyone there knew how to cope with moving over the water. So this is a picture of how all these sites, not only Torcello and Rivo Alto, work, which were the goods that came from the east and were traveled to the west, and which were also the goods that were traveling from the west to the east, like slaves. So if we want to redraw in our mind a site like Venice or Torcello, this is Torcello, for example, we have to imagine detached small island. The square are the houses where organized settlement were very well designed from a central authority, and everything was linked with the presence of water. You can see that there were no bridge at all. There were no bridge at all because everything needed to be connected by water. Why no bridge? Of course, because all the boats and the ships had the tree and the mast, so it wasn't possible to pass through the city in that way. How we had a change, how these settlements, these villages, these places change. Thanks to Save Venice restoration in Torcello, and I take only 1 minute and I'm going to ending. Last July, we were able, for example, in Torcello Santa Maria Assunta Church in the Diaconicon Chapel, to discover over this yellow part, that is the part where the mosaics, the 11th century mosaic, are still there. We found the red part, a decoration of the church that was absolutely unknown and absolutely new. These are pieces of fresco of the original decoration of the church. Pieces of frescoes. Here we have a Saint Martin with also some letters, and these letters are so important because they gave us a clear chronology and a clear also cultural definition of this kind of work of art, that it is absolutely like St. Martin's itself, Carolingian. Also the Virgin Mary, the features, the way that it is painted, the use of color, it is absolutely similar to other Carolingian work of art that we have in northern Italy or in the Alps or even in Germany or in actual France. We spoke all the time about the Origin of Venice, the breakout of Venice like a Byzantine element. But thanks to this discovery, for example, we were able to say that the main church in Torcello, the blue one here, is dated to the 9th century. Now we are quite sure of that. We are working on the final publication also thanks to the, as I said, thanks St. Venice intervention and thanks this big project. But the same narrative can be done in Rialto itself and can be done in Grado itself. So we are seeing that in this pivotal moment when the Carolingian restructured the North Italy, they choose few ports as emporia, as a central trade place that gave to these small communities or medium communities the way to jump in the international arena and start to have international relationships in between the East and the East, and also trading for the Carolingian. I didn't put the image, but probably it was before. We have to remember that the first coin minted in Venice is a Carolingian coin. This is a picture that, for concluding, a picture of our activity around the excavation. We like to have this talk, question, and play also with the archaeological fragments, amphoras, finds with people, with Venetian tourists, and having talks and so on. I hope that this will be possible from this very summer, or at least as soon as possible, and I will invite you, all of you, to come and see what we are doing. So I thank you very much, and I'm going also to copy and paste in the chat all the links about the project, and also a link if you want to download a preliminary publication about Torcello project. Sorry if I was too long. I stop the sharing, and thank you for your patience.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Diego Calaison. I don't think any of us will return to Torcello and see it exactly the same way, with the heroic myth that you and your research has systematically replaced with a different story. So thank you so very much. And I'm sure that people will have questions in a moment about your research. We now move to listen to Melissa Kahn. She is well known to this group. There has been the director of the Venice office of Save Venice for over 20 years. It's really Melissa Kahn's extraordinary combination of skills that's responsible in no small way for the astonishing success of the projects of Save Venice over these past 2 decades. She works regularly with the city's administrative and religious officials, the directors of museums. She works with scholars, archaeologists, art historians, a network of workers on the ground, restorers, archivists, archaeologists as well. She does this with tremendous skill, expert knowledge, impressive diplomacy. At the moment, she's managing over 30 projects. She's here to talk today about what Save Venice is doing in the restorations in the Church of Torcello. Melissa Kahn.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So tonight I just want to give you a brief overview of Save Venice's experiences on Torcello. And of course, when talking about the American love affair with Torcello, we have to mention Ernest Hemingway, who spent the winter of 1948 working on Across the River and Into the Trees, his novel based in Venice. And that novel has been very prominent lately in Venice because for the past 5 months, Liev Schreiber has been filming the screen adaptation of the novel. And so that's been the buzz in Venice, watching this being filmed on Torcello and throughout Venice. So we look forward to that coming out next year and having a little bit more excitement about Torcello. But of course, Save Venice's first experience with Torcello dates back to 1977, when Save Venice joined a group of other international committees to form the International Torcello Committee. And the scope was to restore the mosaics on both walls, the Last Judgment and the apses of the Diaconicon and the central apse. And there you see a familiar Boston figure in my slides. We have Betty McAndrew on the scaffolding of Torcello, Betty being one of the founders of Save Venice, along with her husband, John. Of course, then Save Venice returned to Torcello in 2002 for maintenance of the lower register of the Last Judgment mosaics. And this was then fully restored in 2018 by the Catholic Diocese of Venice. A project that we have ongoing now is the Iconostasis in memory of the Byzantine scholar John Julius Norwich, who is a great friend of Save Venice. This project is being funded by Venice in Peril, for which John Julius was chairman for many years, and Save Venice. So this is ongoing now. We completed the marble elements of the Iconostasis, 11th century Pluthe, and we also made some interesting discoveries because we had to completely dismantle the Iconostasis for restoration. We had to soak the marble elements in vats of deionized water to get all the salts out, and then reconstruct, rebuild the Iconostasis. And when we did that, we actually took down all these panel paintings you see, and we were able to reveal this lintel, which is made of wood. And so carbon-14 testing was done on that lintel and came back with dating it to the 12th century, so 1108 to 1123. We also found fragments of painting on the lintel that had been underneath the capitals. And the testing of the pigments used for that have not come back yet, but we assume that is also 12th century. Now that lintel was used to hold up paintings, which have changed at different times. The paintings that are currently there are from the 15th century, and they are in a restoration lab at the moment. We completed the marble elements of the Iconostasis this summer of 2019, but the panel paintings are quite complicated. They're in various states of conservation, some in pretty good condition, others not so much. Here you can see an example of one of the apostles that there's very little there. And so we've done studies in ultraviolet light, radiant light, and natural light to see if we could reveal an underdrawing or something that would help guide the conservators. In this case, the damage is so severe that there is nothing to help us along, and the painting will be sort of left in the condition it is. But there are other panels of this series that are in more legible condition, and so we don't see it as a problem. Of course, for the 50th anniversary of St. Venice, we adopted the two apses in Torcello and the Italian synagogue in the ghetto. And our main project then in Torcello now are the two apses, the central apse and the Diaconicon apse, and the mosaics. We adopted this project in the summer of 2019. Of course, it was very important to work on the exterior walls as well, because the walls are important for supporting the mosaic, as you can see from the model that I have showing the brickwork and the supporting plaster, the underlying mortar, and how important it is that that's all very well connected. Because if you have any structural issues at any part of that, then you risk losing the mosaic. Now the walls of the exterior apse of Torcello are sort of in traumatic condition, and so it was very important to reinforce them, replace the rotting bricks, and do as much as possible to make sure that was structurally sound. So that work continued all through the fall of 2019 until the high water, the Acqua Alta, struck us in November and December. The work site was flooded on and off for 6 weeks. We ended up at that point, St. Venice, starting the Immediate Response Fund, the American Loves Venice Committee, along with the Italian Embassy in Washington, were able to raise funds to start protecting all the monuments that had been hurt during the floods. In particular, in Torcello, we had our work crew happened to be on duty, staying there when the floods hit, which was tremendously important. So they were able to right away start pumps moving and pump out the baptistry, pump out the crypt, pumped out the work site. We ended up doing GR radar studies on the floor to make sure that the floor was structurally sound. The results were quite positive. We were happy with that. We ended up doing sand bakes for the embankment in the back behind the church to make sure that the canal behind it didn't continue to overflow. And we also did a lot of extra cleaning and extra work. And then, of course, the work site opened again, only to be closed for the COVID restrictions from March until May of 2020. But we did reopen with great spirit and great enthusiasm, and various elements of the restoration continued at that point. The main project from last summer was the Diaconicon Chapel, where we were restoring the mosaics of Christ Pantocrator. And our master mosaic restorer is Giovanni Cucco, who you may recognize from the photo I had earlier, because he also worked on the mosaics in the late 70s and 1980s. So under Giovanni's guidance for all the mosaics, we're going through and listening to see where they're detached. He injects them with lime dust and special mortars, and then goes through a cleaning process. This here you see is the arch of the Diaconicon Chapel. This is over the vault. Above this area is where the frescoes that Diego showed you were found. Here you can see a little bit more of that situation. We started out really worried about the structural stability of the vault, which I'm circling here on your screen. And so it was decided to open a very small section of the roof to see if we could see what the vault looked like, making sure there weren't any cracks, because this was supporting the mosaics. And that's when we saw a little fragment of color, a bit of a word, which led for more of the roof to be opened, as you can see in this section, and then the discovery of the mosaics. Here's Diego peering down into this area of above the vault. And when we finally did discover the frescoes on two different sides, as Diego explained to you, we had the St. Martin fresco and then the Virgin Annunciate on the other side. This area has now been covered over. We closed the roof. We know the frescoes are there and they're safe, but there's no way that they could have been left visible for the public. So at this time, they're well photographed and documented in that way. It was big news in Venice when the frescoes were found. There was a press conference on July 23rd. given by the Patriarch of Venice in the Catholic Diocese. And Diego and I both spoke to a public there explaining the finds. And there was quite a bit of news and press all over the world. So this is something very exciting for, say, Venice. As we continued in August, we found more fresco fragments in the area of the crypt, possibly 9th century as well. This was in an area underneath an altar that I'm circling where the workman is. They're at ground level, so they're more at risk from high water and from decay, basically from the humidity. So decisions are not clear yet what will be done with those frescoes, whether we're able to preserve them better. But in the meantime, it's another source of study and another confirmation of how richly decorated the church was in the 9th century. Here you can see in October of 2020, we have our mosaic expert, Giovanni Cucco, being interviewed for the Venice, A Love Letter to Venice, was the production that Say Venice put together as a reminder that Venice is still here for you, that we're still in love with Venice. And in this picture, you can really see the mosaics very well lit and just how beautiful they are now that they were nearly completed at this phase. And you can see the whole vaulted area where we're talking about the frescoes above. Of course, here the mosaic was completed in December of 2020. And we're moving on to the central apse. And so the project that took place in November and December was in this area of the Synthronum, which is the raised choir, basically, where the bishop would have sat at the top of the stairs here. And as you can see, there's marble sheeting all along, with a small area in the corner where in the 1930s, during a restoration intervention, the sheeting was removed and revealed some fresco fragments. So in our conservation, we were able to remove the rest of the sheeting and found more remnants of frescoes. They look like a series of bishops, possibly. We're missing all their heads because the mosaics were put in, say, toward the 11th century, covering it over. But this is an interesting example of the two different decorative styles. And we're not quite sure what's going to happen with those frescoes, whether we'll get permission from the Ministry of Culture to leave them exposed to show these two different decorations from two different periods or not. But it was certainly an interesting find and a very happy discovery. You can see a little closer up, they're quite detailed and beautiful colors if they were at some point integrated to a certain point and cleaned. But the work continues on Torcello now. So we build up the scaffolding so that we could work on the mosaics of the apostles. And that's the level you see here. We have the apostles. You can see here when the Italian television crew came to visit in October and talked with our conservator, Giovanni Cucco, about his work and how he was sort of testing and mapping out the conditions of the apostles. Here you can see the scaffolding more build up. We have this platform here, and then the different levels so that our restorers can work, injecting the resins and then cleaning the surface. These little dots that you see on the apostles are the areas that Mr. Cucco decides that's where he needs to make injections. These are sort of areas that are in need of greater attention. The next phase, what we'll be doing is raising the scaffolding. I think on March 1st is the date we've decided, moving up higher so that we'll be able to work on the Angel Gabriel and the Virgin Annunciate that we have on the right side, and give our full attention to the Madonna Oligitria. Here you can see in this photograph, I think the damage is quite evident throughout it. This mosaic was actually detached at one point. And sometimes if you look at it carefully, you can see the different lines of the different sections that were detached and then reattached. So the work now will involve a lot of cleaning and consolidating to make sure that the pieces are firmly in place, because of the fact that this is a curved surface, it's even more difficult. There's a very small area of a cleaning patch, which shows fantastic results. This was done one day when I was on the scaffolding with Giovanni Cucco, just cleaning it with very mild soap and brushing it, just getting off the surface dirt, and we can see the amazing difference it makes with the brilliant blue. So this is undoubtedly going to be a fantastically beautiful mosaic, and we really couldn't be happier with the results we're having on Torcello. Of course, none of this would be possible without the support of so many of our donors. The donor campaign is still open on this anniversary project. We're still looking for more funds. There's still elements that can be adopted. But in the meantime, I'd really like to thank the Boston chapter for being so actively involved in Torcello. So many of your members have been large contributors, and it's something that really means a lot to us at Save Venice. So I guess I'll stop my screen share now, and I'm sure there are lots of questions for Diego.
Melissa, thank you so very much for that. What an exciting project and exciting discoveries along the way. We do have time for some questions, and I think maybe the best way we could do it, if you want to turn your videos on, if you have a question, either you can raise your physical hand, you can go to participants at the bottom of the screen, find your own name and find the way to raise your virtual hand, or if you wish, you can just say your question.
So this is Frederick. Quick question for Diego then. If I understand it correctly, the Byzantine origin of Venice was to give a kind of improved origin, right? Different from other, different from other Italian cities, say. So what is the Byzantine role? Does it not really come in till 10th, 11th century? Does it, I mean, it precedes the Crusade in 1204, but when is the period of real Byzantine influence? Because it certainly is present in the later Middle Ages and in Venetian traditions, but when does it become really strong?
Yeah, it is absolutely a good question. We can say that in somehow the all these settlements are Byzantine, as all the North Italy was Byzantine in between the 5th and the 6th century. So a very distant province with element in sharing with Byzantine, but the real Byzantineness, let's call like that, is something that is started at the end of 10th century, beginning of 11th century. So when the city and the harbor and the trade are really set up, we can see there is a change on the main harbor that the Venetian fleet reached. Up to the 9th century, mostly all the trips were directed to Alexandria in Egypt. Only at the end of the 10th century, mostly of the travel of the ships' routes were directed to Constantinople. From that moment, we can say that we have a slow Byzantinization of the city, that it started with a trade connection and it became really a cultural connection. So there is a way to washing back the history of Venice and make also the early history of Venice less European, less Carolingian. Also in a moment that being Carolingian means being German in somehow, and has a lot of problem also in the relationship with the Pope, with Rome, with the Southern Europe, today Southern Europe, the Mediterranean. And also there is a reason that is connected with the new Mediterranean, where being connected with the Byzantine center is much more relevant also for religion reason. That Constantinople started to become a center of Christianity in a way that it wasn't in the 6th and the 7th century. So this link is more powerful than any other. And in somehow the fact that Pietro Orsello, Pietro Orsello is the son of the Duke in Venice, and he's the bishop who made the restoration in the 11th century of the Basilica. He's calling a group of mosaic artists, Mosaics artists from Constantinople. It is really the idea that you want to make Byzantine something that is there and this is relevant. And you look from, you saw from Melissa's presentation, these two theories of saint and bishops in the main apse. At the beginning, we have painted bishops, so local clergy, local authorities. Orsello made the change and made the mosaics with saints. So there is this transformation from a local place that is worshipping, let me use this word, a local community that is transforming towards a more international arena, Mediterranean arena, and it becomes, this church become, in a Byzantine way, a church of the Mediterranean area with this link. So from that very moment, we have everything that starts to be Byzantine. And with the early 13th century, with the Fourth Crusade, the process, I think, is, it reaches peak, and we have really a Byzantine city.
Thank you. Great.
Wonderful. Is there another question?
If I may, Melissa, hi, this is Frederick again. One question just about, here we are in the time of COVID. We're not listening to you in the comforts of the Chilton Club because we're supposed to stay apart. What has happened for, say, Venice's work, particularly in Torcello, about distance, and what are the protocols? How are they different from normal times?
When the worksite reopened at the end of May, we had to adapt, obviously, the COVID regulations. The workers all are masked. When you visit the worksite, you have to have your temperature taken. We don't bring in outside people, or very rarely. Don't bring in visitors. The church was open during the summer, but then closed again in the fall. And we use it to our advantage, basically, when, unfortunately, these sites and museums have to close their churches, because then we can spread out the work site. It was ideal at Torcello because with the interior being closed, it was a bit more guarded, a better situation for the workers. So I should say that aside from the shutdown really in March and April, we've been going full force ahead despite it all, because this is essential work and people are happy to do it.
Great, thank you. That's really comforting to know that just how much progress has happened last summer, this fall, and even now. Wonderful, thank you.
Is there another question? I wanted to ask, yes, Chris Carl-Smith.
So a minute ago, Diego mentioned this kind of transition from the bishops to the saints. And so I had a question, really, I guess, for Melissa about that. Now that you've taken off the sheeting and you've revealed that these bishops are there and you're kind of looking at them and trying to understand what's there, do you have a guess about, will they stay exposed, or will the ministry say that the sheeting should go back up, or would they be moved to someplace else, or will they be put under plexiglass? Like what are the options going forward in terms of, or do you cover them all up like you did with the St. Martin's frescoes?
Well, in this situation, we really are waiting to see, working it through with the Ministry of Culture, because that decision ultimately comes from them. So I think Diego will be working a bit with me to help maybe convince them. I think we'd like to see those remain exposed, even though it does show a sort of truncated decoration. The first three to the left were already uncovered in the 1930s. And so you already had that strange situation with partially the three pieces, and then the rest with the marble sheeting. The marble sheeting is not particularly precious. It's not decorated. It's something that if it were taken down, you wouldn't really be missing anything. It's more of the question maybe of the aesthetics of having these two different decorative cycles a little bit in competition, and perhaps from a cult religious point of view, if whether that's considered okay to have this incomplete type of decoration. You would just leave the marble sheeting off and you'd leave them exposed. You wouldn't have to cover them. It's just mostly it's going to be an aesthetic decision, or a little bit of courage from the Ministry of Culture to decide to go ahead and leave that off, because there's a tendency if something is covered to leave it covered. With the roof, we didn't have any choice. We had to, there wasn't anything you could do. You could talk about detaching something, but you have this sense that you detach a fresco and it loses its original location. It's saved, but it's out of place. In Torcello, there was really no place to put the detached frescoes in a museum setting. Maybe someday we'll go back up and take them off and do that. But a lot of decisions have to be made, and it'll be a lot of collaboration between archaeologists, art historians, and religious authorities to make up our minds on what we can do.
Yeah, if I may add something, that we have a problem in Italy with restoration and conservation. I mean that we are quite good in doing so, but we have a little bit victim of this idea of authenticity. And this authenticity issue cover also the restoration. So if someone before us did a restoration, we have also to preserve what he did before us. And so we are not really allowed by this our perception of a good conservation practice to remove things or change perspective. And in somehow we are not so brave to ask community. And with community, I mean not only the Torcello people, the 12 inhabitants, but the Venetian, the international community, the donors, so people that who have a voice in the building, in the heritage, and really decide what is the modern, the contemporary way of dealing with this kind of question. And so, for example, the idea of having something that let us to know the complex architectonical and decoration history of the church, so leaving the two levels to see, is something that is a very contemporary way to use the heritage, to use the church. So we need also your voice to change slowly this traditional way that somehow laws and practice more than laws impose to the Ministry of Culture.
Well, today has been such an insight into the nuts and bolts of the research on the ground, in the ground, all the way up to practical questions of restoration, to aesthetic questions of what's preserved and what's not preserved, and not least the element of getting permissions in a time of pandemic. And so this has been such a rich afternoon. We want to thank Diego Calaison, Melissa Kahn for your presentation from Italy. I would remind all of you that we will join together again March 30th, Tuesday evening, 6 p.m. Robert Kushner, Jorge Bombo for Venice Through the Eyes of Painters. We hope to see all of you then. Thank you.